Mena Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
A very warm welcome, Professor Wolffsohn. Thank you so very much for having found the time for this conversation about current affairs, about Iran and about Israel, regarding which you possess such great expertise. We're conducting this interview on a Friday. We know that right now it's possible that the US might attack Iran, so quite extreme military deployments are currently being observed there. Aircraft carriers are positioned in the Strait of Hormuz and so on. What do you anticipate will unfold in the coming hours or days? What scenarios are truly possible?
I must preface this by stating that I actually failed the prophecy course. And,
a pity.
Yes, what can one do? And besides, for us Jews as well, the age of prophecy is long past, and therefore all I can really do here is simply engage in a bit of pure guesswork and speculation. Any predictions would be completely unreliable, but one thing is absolutely clear. If the US conditions, which I wholeheartedly believe are righteous and appropriate, are not fulfilled, then a military strike will most certainly take place. Whether a military strike will be carried out solely by the US or in conjunction with Israel remains to be seen. Israel, I suspect, would react, if at all. So if Iran, in order to indirectly weaken the US, were to attack Israel before Israel intervenes, then Israel would indeed reactively intervene. That is exactly the situation we're in.
In what form do you believe this military strike would take place? Is it a targeted elimination of their nuclear facilities, or do you think the US is genuinely interested in a regime change in Tehran?
Well, I couldn't exactly be a fly on the wall, neither at the American nor the Israeli General Staff. But from my perspective, the most promising approach would involve more than just targeting nuclear facilities. The most promising approach would be if one didn't only, and I say only in quotes, to activate not only the classic military scenario but also significantly galvanize the Iranian population against their own regime. Now, I don't mean large-scale demonstrations, but rather the following. For Western intelligence agencies, especially the Mossad and American services, there's truly nothing within Iran itself that remains a secret to them, meaning they have extensive knowledge. And why is that? Because a significant portion of the educated and professional elite in Iran wants absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with this tyrannical regime. This, in turn, implies that from the Iranian regime's viewpoint, there are spies. However, from the perspective of the US and Israel, these are indeed valuable collaborators. Local collaborators who are willing to readily provide all of this critical intelligence to both Israel and the United States of America, neither to the Austrian intelligence service nor, strangely enough, to the German intelligence service. Anyway.
Austrians, I get that.
Yes, quite possibly. And with relatively modest means, for example, using explosives, one could easily cripple the command and control centers within Iran. Let me offer a concrete example so our viewers and listeners can plainly see that this isn't merely some far-fetched fantasy. How else, I ask, could the Israelis have succeeded in penetrating Iran's secret, indeed its most highly classified nuclear archive several years prior, if they hadn't been armed with such crucial insider intelligence beforehand? Or for the American and Israeli bombers to know precisely where and when they would need to strike, what target to hit. They can only accomplish that with an exceptional infrastructure of intelligence information at their disposal. And such a connection would also provide the opportunity to access the highest echelons of Iran's leadership, quite similarly to the situation with Maduro. Because that too is a sign, isn't it? How was that even possible? Not just because the Americans bombed, but because they knew precisely where and when Mr. Maduro was sleeping, or even awake. And the very fact that they knew demonstrates the American Security Service's intelligence was so exceptional, so outstanding, that it was possible to reach the very pinnacle, to put it in a seemingly contradictory way, the top of the top. And that's supposed to be impossible in Iran? Absolutely not, because otherwise a substantial portion of the military leadership wouldn't have been eliminated last June. So, in short, from my perspective, and hopefully, the most sensible solution would be a classic military approach combined with using intelligence and security service information to target and eliminate the infrastructure, both human and material.
Now, as we know, there isn't really a real opposition in Iran. What would that mean internally for the country's domestic politics? There is one person pushing himself to the forefront. That's the former Shah's son, whom some people want. Many say that this might not be the optimal choice, but what would that entail for the country itself if there were no opposition? And what about the role of the Kurds in the north? Wouldn't the country just descend into a civil war, which many analysts also foresee?
Indeed, analysts consistently look back and quite rightly recall what happened in Iraq following the 2003 military intervention that brought about the end of Saddam's regime. Furthermore, they also remember the military intervention in Libya back in 2011. That is absolutely correct, and structurally speaking, it is entirely achievable, even practical. I truly think that the question of the Shah's son, whether one is for or against him, is merely a transitional issue. One really needs to approach this by thoroughly examining the very structure of the state, and the structure of the state of Iran is precisely the same, fragmented and ultimately an artificial product, very much like many other post-colonial states around the world. However, Iran is not merely a product of the post-colonial developments that shaped so many other nations. But you mentioned the keyword Kurds. Iran, you see, is a multi-ethnic state. If Iran is to be preserved as a unified state, as a single administrative unit, and if internal peace is to be maintained, in my humble opinion, it can only truly be achieved through federalization. The key phrase for that is peace through federalism. This means, to mention the largest minorities, you were absolutely correct in drawing attention to the Kurds again. Then there are the Arabs in Iran, who are certainly not Persians.
Sunnis.
However, those are Shiites.
But there's a Sunni part too.
Quite small, yes, and in the southeast, which is the next significant part of the minority, specifically the Baloch. They, of course, aren't Persians either. And the Baloch people are distributed across 3 distinct states in this particular region: Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. These states are themselves quite precarious, not least due to their multinationality and their inherent multi-ethnic composition. But let's return to Iran. And then naturally we have the Azeris, because the northern region of Iran is in fact South Azerbaijan. Over the course of history, this region has become an integral part of Iran. There were even periods, I haven't checked recently to verify this, when the official website of the state of Azerbaijan recognized the northern Azeri portion of Iran as part of Azerbaijan. Of Iran recognized as an integral part of Azerbaijan within their official narratives. In other words, and especially in Austria, people know what return to the homeland means. So, if the Azeris are to remain in Iran, whether they should, want to, or even must, one cannot simply bypass the autonomy of these mentioned minorities. Thus, the most sensible solution would be for the Shah's son to act as a transitional figure, much like Juan Carlos in Spain, enabling both the democratization and federalization of Iran. This approach would address the complex internal dynamics and regional interests at play within the country, because without proper federalization, it simply won't be possible. In this regard, I'm very pessimistic, and I want to give you a concrete example from my own experience. I was approached by an opposition publication closely affiliated with the Shah's son. They asked me to develop a future scenario for a peaceful Iran, a scenario that would include and consider all the diverse elements. I had this idea that to develop a future scenario for a peaceful Iran, and he had presented this outline to me. outline presented, that is, federalization alongside democratization, where one is inconceivable without the other. So, a two-chamber system and extensive autonomy. We know this from the Federal Republic of Germany, Austria too, of course, with its federal states. It apparently works quite well, or so I've been told. And in Switzerland, the cantons, with varying degrees of independence, can also be managed that way. And in the USA, the states, these are successful models. Yes, and in that publication it wasn't accepted, with the justification given that federalization would lead to the destruction of the Iranian state. My thesis, however, argues precisely the opposite. If anything, it actually strengthens the cohesion of these artificial constructs, which have been shaped by history and not least by post-colonial history. This applies less to Iran, but it applies to practically all post-colonial states. If this isn't done, then we'll find ourselves in civil war situations, much like what we've witnessed in Sudan, in Libya, and numerous other places. Congo, Burundi, and Rwanda, and so on and so forth as well, perpetually. We'll have this permanently. This means there's a design flaw in the international community of states. And now, let's return to Iran. Iran faces this significant challenge and absolutely must address it. And if it doesn't solve this problem, then at some point in the future, the state of Iran will fall apart. Mind you, that's without me having successfully passed any prophecy course at all.
But of course, the Americans know that too. Do you think they'll take that risk?
I don't know if the Americans know that. I can't judge. We basically encountered this exact situation in 2003 with the conflict in Iraq. Back then, it was actually just as obvious to federalize Iraq, and that would have been relatively simple to achieve there. You have the Kurdish north, then you have the Sunni central part, which is the Sunni Arab center, and down in the south you'll find the Shiite Arab territorial division. So federalization would have been the most sensible point in that situation. And since you ask about America, European wisdom on this matter isn't really any more developed than it is in the United States. The Kurds, especially in northern Iraq, already had practical autonomy and were truly on the verge of proclaiming their own independent state, their very own country. And the European Union, among others, said, you bad guys, that's not allowed. The Americans also said that, even before Donald Trump. In other words, concerning this specific matter, I dramatically question the wisdom displayed by Western governments.
So, what would the implications be for Israel if Iran were to be attacked, for instance, sometime over the weekend? Would Israel then be drawn into this conflict? Should attacks be anticipated? Is Israel truly prepared for that, given that Iran, as we know, has been aggressively rearming itself in recent weeks and months? What could potentially happen there?
Part 1. If Israel were to engage in a preemptive strike, its core territory would remain relatively secure, because the Israeli attacks would quite naturally be directed squarely against those rocket launch pads. However, if Iran were to initiate an attack on Israel for both tactical and crucially strategic reasons, then this would be the outcome. Undoubtedly, some Iranian missiles would strike Israeli territory, but their number would be considerably fewer than those actually fired. Because in the meantime, Israel has also developed a more advanced and effective missile defense system, and that is precisely the very reason why all nations are so intensely interested in acquiring Israel's entire advanced missile defense system, encompassing its short-range, medium-range, and long-range missile defense capabilities. So, in summary, yes, Israel will unfortunately have to absorb some damage, but militarily, it will emerge significantly more powerful. And let's not forget one thing. We haven't yet talked about Israel's neighboring states.
I was just about to ask.
Okay.
But please, feel free to start. Exactly, what does this mean for Syria? Or rather, the better question would probably be, what does this mean for the Gulf states? So are they fully aligned with the Americans on this? Does that make sense for them? They've been trying to put on the brakes in recent weeks and months because they don't want a major conflict in the region.
Yes, that's what's presented to the public. But true politics, genuine politics, isn't just what's visible on the main stage, it's what unfolds backstage, out of sight. And I'm quite surprised that both academia and the media are completely failing to register one very significant fact for a while now. 2020, there has been the Middle East air defense. This is an unformalized, indeed, an unformalized alliance, specifically referring to the Middle East air defense system. It's crucial to note that this arrangement is, in fact, not formalized. It is made up of the following states, primarily these particular states. The Gulf states, all Oman and Kuwait are in, so to speak, with one foot in, but Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, and many others as well. And Israel, Egypt, and Jordan are all involved, and now Syria as well. So, and then those who participate, what possible interest could Saudi Arabia potentially truly gain from a strong Iran? Against an Iran that for many decades has been inciting the Shiite population within Saudi Arabia to rise up in opposition to the Saudi government. And the Shiites in Saudi Arabia? That's easily said, but what truly lies behind it all, in fact? Where do they live in Saudi Arabia? Specifically in eastern Saudi Arabia. Right, that's a direction, but what exactly is located in the east of Saudi Arabia? It is precisely there, oil and natural gas. This implies that if Iranian policy becomes successful, or were to be, then Saudi Arabia would likely become as wealthy and prosperous as the Congo. To put it another way, what possible interest would the Saudi royal family have in protecting Iran? Absolutely none. No interest whatsoever. In other words, when they say, you Americans, no, you cannot fly over our territory, and you Israelis, you are not allowed to. You are permitted to, essentially.
So you are of the opinion that the Gulf states would indeed be very much interested in a regime change in Iran without even having any idea what would actually follow?
Of course. Even if they don't know what's coming, it's certainly going to be better for the Gulf states than what they're experiencing today.
But now, a weakened Iran isn't really hurting them much, is it?
But how long can Iran remain weakened if the very same regime stays in power? Not for long. After all, Iran rearmed itself following the attacks in April and June of last year. They rearmed themselves significantly. So, in short, yes, they have indeed rearmed. Guns? Yes. Missiles? Yes. Butter for the population?
That is the other, and especially the major issue. Let's move on from Iran for a moment and turn to Israel. Donald Trump announced in the last few days that he wants to pump billions into Gaza. How do you view these peace activities? What are your thoughts on them? How do you assess them? What do you believe the future of Gaza will be?
It is quite customary, isn't it, to react to this proposal by simply going, ha ha ha. And, as I always say, he who laughs last laughs the best. So, we truly don't know if this will end up as a laughingstock or not. I consider it to be quite probable, in fact, more likely for this plan to actually succeed rather than to fail. That this plan will succeed than that it will fail. And I believe that will wipe the smiles off his opponents' faces, irrespective of Trump's personality. So why then? Is it really such a bad thing to develop the Gaza Strip, to just... From the plans I've seen, they are just awful. It's like Las Vegas in the Gaza Strip. It is absolutely tasteless, beyond all reason. However, the opulent prosperity of Las Vegas undeniably represents a commercial triumph, regardless of my personal feelings towards it. I've been there. I think it's basically hell on earth, but you know, the people there are actually doing quite well. Some even voluntarily move there to establish their lives, to reside and contribute their work. In essence, it can only get better from here. So, but the prerequisite for it to be built up, for its reconstruction, because one cannot construct houses and develop infrastructure when there is ongoing gunfire. and it means that the disarmament of Hamas completely and effectively is a conditio sine qua non. So the next question that arises then is, who will disarm Hamas? So the Europeans are very actively demanding that Hamas be disarmed. Yes, and that absolutely must happen, and so forth. But when push truly comes to shove, we've heard that things get pretty shaky. The only state so far that has really committed to it is
Indonesia.
Huh?
Indonesia, I believe.
Yes, but Indonesia has announced that while its soldiers will enter the Gaza Strip, they basically won't do much beyond standard police actions. And police actions and disarming a terrorist group that simply cannot be reconciled, they are fundamentally incompatible. Greece has expressed its willingness to actively engage in the disarmament of Hamas. And believe it or not, Albania and Kosovo, both Muslim-majority states, have also committed to doing so. This is quite significant. So that too, from a symbolic standpoint, is incredibly significant, yet it's barely ever brought up or discussed. At least, that's something I personally have only seen reported in the Israeli news. Please correct me if you happen to have better information on this particular matter. I haven't read it here. But you always hear all this big talk, as they say in Berlin, disarm, disarm, disarm. Yet when it comes to delivering something yourself, there isn't much to be found. All these grand pronouncements about the Gaza war, genocide, Israel and so forth, and all the Free Palestine rhetoric, they talk a big game. But when it actually comes to disarming the terrorists and truly establishing the genuine foundations for an initial ceasefire, they just back off and play the sophisticated gentleman. Where is the consistency in that? And I'm not even going to ask, where is the morality in such an act?
Now, of course, there's criticism from the other side regarding Trump's peace plans, or rather the Europeans' inaction, which we've already discussed, and the crucial fact that no Palestinians are included in any of these comprehensive plans. This lack of Palestinian involvement is a major point of contention. Now, two questions for you. First, which specific Palestinians could be included in these peace plans? Does such a group exist? Is there an opposition, either abroad or within the Palestinian community itself, that could possibly support these kinds of plans? Who are the proper contacts?
Good question. I'll ask you back. Hamas? That truly cannot be the case. The Palestinian Authority, thoroughly corrupt and utterly incompetent, completely unable to properly organize its own society in the West Bank, quite irrespective of what the Israeli government has done or failed to do. The tragedy of the Palestinian people, and this is truly a point that receives far too little consideration. I am explicitly speaking of a tragedy that has befallen the Palestinian people. It is undeniably true, yet it is not an act of genocide. Rather, it represents the profound tragedy of the Palestinian people, stemming from the fact that throughout the entire historical trajectory of the Palestinian national movement, there has existed a leadership which, in hindsight, from the analytical viewpoint of a clear-headed historian, has led its own people into catastrophe, has led them into catastrophe. All the precise and specific plans that existed for Palestinian statehood, and indeed they truly did exist, that both the Zionist organization initially and subsequently the State of Israel had approved, have unfortunately been rejected. I will give you just one of many incredibly crucial points. It is the hardly even mentioned, yet critically overlooked. Mentioned, unfortunately, the scarcely remembered Camp David Accords. Let's consider September 1978. It was always said, and here we are back to the question, why are facts not acknowledged? There were two distinct parts. Part one was purely bilateral, involving Israel and Egypt. Part two concerned Judea, Samaria or the West Bank, to use the more restrained phrasing, plus the Gaza Strip as well. What did it say? It stated that within a specific time frame, I'd have to check the exact details again, but I believe it was 5 years, Israel would completely withdraw from all the occupied territories. And the word state was the only thing missing, but it was absolutely clear that then a Palestinian state would emerge, who signed the Camp David Accords and subsequently, word for word, the Israeli-Egyptian Peace Treaty of March 1979. Menachem Begin. Was Menachem Begin a left-wing extremist who always approached the Palestinians or anyone else with a peace dove in hand, as if that was his only agenda? No, he was the most right-wing Israeli politician at the time, and he signed exactly that, making it binding under international law. And what was Arafat's reaction at the time? He spearheaded the organization of both the resistance and subsequently the rejectionist front across the Arab Islamic world. This movement ultimately culminated in the eruption of the First Intifada, which spanned from December of 1987 until 1993. Then the same Camp David II and the Taba Agreement, which was signed in January 2000, covering 97% of the West Bank. And East Jerusalem as the capital for the Palestinians under Barak. Then the Gaza Strip was evacuated in 2005. Why? And it was by the hardliner Sharon specifically. It was explicitly stated, Aza Trila, Gaza first. What does first imply? It's like an opera's overture. And as we know, the overture is followed by the entire opera. So first actually meant it was a trial phase for a Palestinian state. What was the reaction to that? Unrelenting rocket fire, beginning in 2007, after Hamas took control and seized power in the Gaza Strip. Just some of the most critical recent ones. The Palestinian people must emancipate themselves from this leadership.
That was my very next question. Do you truly believe the Palestinian people possess the capacity or options to genuinely effect a change in their leadership? And as a follow-up, who might such individuals be? Do such figures even exist?
People? What kind of a power base do these individuals possess? And which societal groupings are standing firmly behind them? And there lies this significant question mark. This is indeed the tragedy of the Palestinian population, of the Palestinian people, that in this ongoing conflict, which always has two sides to it, unfortunately hasn't managed to develop an independent politically institutional diversity. This diversity would ideally be institutionally capable of offering a genuine alternative to the current leadership, something crucial in any given situation. That is the essence and the huge advantage of a democracy, of an institutionalized democracy. So, if you vote Party A out of office in a democracy, you know Party B is coming in. They also make promises that can't always be kept, but you know that. And that's what you just don't have in Palestinian society. There, the internal Palestinian conflicts have always been violently fought out with severe consequences. Think, most recently and above all, of the civil war that erupted between Fatah and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, ultimately concluding with Hamas's victory in 2007. That has absolutely nothing to do with democracy, and if you don't have social groups that institutionalize themselves, then you have no real points of contact. And there we are again with the pure empty rhetoric of the world's politicians, and not least also the European politicians who proclaim, yes, just negotiate with them. For example, the president of the German parliament was recently in Israel, and she was criticized for not having engaged in discussions with the Palestinians. Okay, she could have at best spoken with some very reasonable, moderate and intelligent Palestinians. There are plenty of them, but they have no real power base. She could have taken some nice photos, perhaps enjoyed some good tea, certainly better than the Wysotsky tea offered in Israel or other similar options. To make a long story short, there's just too much talk without the necessary political foundation and, frankly, the knowledge to back it up. And I must say, the European policy regarding Israel and the Middle East is simply nothing more than a pipe dream. And that has been true for the security policy of Europeans, as we have now observed for decades. And now an American named Donald Trump comes along and tells the Europeans, you have to, and then they cry bloody murder. Once again, truly not the most sympathetic individual on this earth. But what that means, he's basically shattering the alliance. Well, if the alliance was just about the Americans having to pull someone's chestnuts out of the fire, which was the case, he says no thanks. And now it's up to you to do it. And of course, we Europeans, you, me, all of us who have enjoyed this wonderful life thanks to American assistance and protection, we're now all screaming terribly, oh, that dreadful Trump. Yes, he's quite disagreeable, but for decades we haven't done our homework, and that certainly applies to Israel and the Middle East.
Aber wir haben seit Jahrzehnten nicht die Hausaufgaben gemacht und das gilt für Israel und Nahost.
Last question, maybe on Israel's domestic politics. Israel will likely vote this fall. Do you really believe there's going to be a change in government? One more question, perhaps the final one. Does Israel really need a political fresh start with completely new leadership?
There's never a completely fresh slate of personnel. And the thing is,
there are always new faces that emerge.
The new faces that come along, they simply switch positions from being in government to the opposition if there is indeed a change in administration or a shift in power. So there are always new personalities appearing here and there. So the former chief of staff, the one with that rather unfortunate name, Eisenkot, he in any case would be the only truly fresh new face to emerge, and the possible next prime minister, if it isn't Netanyahu again, would then be Bennett. He's not a completely new face either. So, but let's return to the analytical perspective. Regardless of the fact that Netanyahu isn't as empirically terrible as many portray him to be, those who only emphasize the negative aspects, the simple fact of the matter is Netanyahu completely divides the nation, and that simply does not create a very good foundation for any kind of internal development. It is in essence a kind of civil war, but one fought entirely without actual weapons being used. That has been waged up until now. That is not a sustainable situation. And in that respect, it would truly be the best thing that Netanyahu could possibly do in the interest of statehood and internal peace, but which he will not do, is to step down. Perhaps if he gets pardoned, no matter what compromise formula is eventually reached or what terms are agreed upon, I have absolutely no doubt that he will be pardoned. I am thoroughly convinced there was a secret understanding or deal struck between Herzog, who is now the president, and Netanyahu right around the time Herzog was elected to that office. Why do I say this? This isn't just mere speculation or conjecture on my part either. Herzog's election to the presidency was secured through the votes cast by the Likud party. That would not have been possible without the explicit approval of Netanyahu. And this entire trial situation was already quite predictable back then. So that's part one.
A backroom deal, as we know it?
Yes, it wasn't publicly announced on the main stage, because there too the question of polarization is present, but with the signs completely reversed. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. So in one way or another, a solution must be found, and I suspect that Trump, so to speak, must and will be the strong man from the outside and is absolutely prepared to do so. That doesn't bother him at all. To some, he's the bad guy. To others, he's the good guy. But in any case, he's the one who can push it through. And that, in turn, raises the question in Israel. Are we still a sovereign state, or are we basically the?
That was going to be my next question.
Exactly, of course. Yes, a smaller nation will inevitably be less powerful than a larger one. Big surprise there. So, this also holds true for Israel. As mighty as Israel is, it can only maintain such strength with the USA's involvement. Getting back to domestic politics. So the way things are looking now, Netanyahu won't be stepping down. There's not going to be a majority for the Netanyahu bloc. At least that's what the polls clearly indicate up to this very moment and day. What will clearly follow after a possible military intervention in Iran will be the very next question we absolutely must consider and discuss. However, the undeniably successful military action taken last year, specifically in April and June of 2025, only provided the Likud party with a fleeting short-term advantage. Therefore, it will probably turn out like this. Today's opposition will be stronger than the current government, but they will have less than 60 votes in the parliament of 120 members. This means, and this is a very interesting story, a huge opportunity for the country, that the approximately 10 Arab mandates will ultimately decide whether there will be a formal or an informal coalition government holding the ultimate sway. So, what does this actually mean? It signifies that this is not purely an arithmetic question, but rather the pivotal issue of whether and to what extent the Arab citizens within the Jewish state will achieve greater autonomy than they currently possess. Increased self-determination, whether that eventually leads to a form of autonomy like the personal autonomy that was present in the late stages of the Habsburg Empire, which I hold in very high esteem. Otto Bauer, Karl Renner. This is, if you will, a truly ingenious concept for a peaceful way forward, for the peaceful coexistence and cooperation within a multi-ethnic state. And this is the really big chance that it is possible in a Jewish state that understands itself as a Jewish state. But it also poses a challenge to the ultra-Orthodox, so that they also recognize the inner Jewish minority, and even today, the majority of the non-religious, the non-Orthodox, are not tyrannized in the manner that they are currently. Thus, my analysis, grounded in current polls, ongoing observations, and evolving trends within Israeli society, encompassing, we might say, the weariness concerning Netanyahu, and notably the justifiable outrage directed at the ultra-Orthodox, who also evade military service, saying, "Oh yes, we are studying Talmud." While that is perfectly legitimate, this too is a phenomenon that reflects a deeper issue. What I don't comprehend is why secular Israelis aren't able to outmaneuver the ultra-Orthodox by employing their very own methods. What does that signify? It means, first and foremost, as stated in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, that is the absolute undeniable foundation. It's perfectly clear that everyone who is capable indeed must also has to fulfill their military service. Then there are special exceptions like pre-marriage, post-marriage, bereavement cases, and so forth. You can read it all in the Torah. You can discuss that with the ultra-Orthodox.
So
it is you who are breaking the Torah's commandments, not us. You are the ones who are violating them. Next point. One might say, well, the Talmud states this, that, and the other. But no, the Talmudic sages didn't merely engage in the study of Talmud Torah, developing the Talmud and scrutinizing the Torah. They were individuals deeply immersed in their professional lives who would then take a break to rest.
study it.
And who then went on to engage in Talmud Torah studies, eventually developing the Talmud. These were all people who men at that time were in professions. And what do today's ultra-Orthodox do? They sit there and pray and pray and read and read. That's fine, freedom of expression. Freedom
doesn't fit in the system.
Not anymore. So suddenly, and in my opinion, this is the huge opportunity Israel now has, A, to liberalize the Jewish character of the Jewish state to such an extent that there is, I'd say, an autonomous system. For the Arab population, that the autonomy of the ultra-Orthodox, however it may be defined, will be modified, is relativized, it's modified, and that ultra-Orthodoxy, against its own will, is truly led back to the very roots of Judaism itself. However, if that does not come to pass, and if the prevailing friend-enemy dynamic continues within Israel, then that will ultimately prove to be poison for the long-term future of the Jewish state. So time and again we've discussed the domestic political developments in Germany, Europe and Israel. Without internal peace, it's impossible to move forward.
It's not going to work.
Especially without the willingness to not demonize the other side, inner peace simply cannot be attained. And this internal peace can only truly be attained if you engage yourself with the other. But to do that, you have to know them and then beat them at their own game and say, but this is also perfectly legitimate. I have to figure out myself how to do that because it's undeniable. No, Israel is not an apartheid state. That accusation is utterly absurd. However, it's equally clear that in the allocation of political resources, the Arab population has been underserved. One could say, well.
You can see that.
But no, that is fundamentally and clearly the actual outcome of a democracy. Because what exactly constitutes politics within a democracy? There's that truly wonderful definition offered by the Austrian-born American political scientist Leifhardt. Politics is who gets what, when, and how.
Who gets what, when, and how.
And because in the democratic process, the Arab population failed to develop a politically influential bloc now, for the very first time they do have one, they have received fewer resources than others. That has nothing to do with Israeli racism, let alone apartheid, but with the very
normal ones
of democracy.
Exactly, I'm curious. We'll know in a few months if your theories pan out and are implemented. Thank you very much.
Mena Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.